My brother told me it was a family-only event when he banned me from our parents' 40th anniversary gala. He said my corporate vibe ruined the aesthetic. My mother then picked up the line and demanded my customary $10,000 gift anyway. I did not argue. I wired the money, threw away their expensive vintage wine, and booked a first-class flight to Switzerland. 7 days later, my mother called me sobbing, begging for a bailout to stop the federal marshals at her door. I took a slow sip of my espresso and asked if we even knew each other. My name is Elena. I am 34 years old and I work as a senior liquidation specialist for a private equity firm in Manhattan. Before I tell you how I legally dismantled my relatives and seized their entire estate, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you love seeing arrogant people walk blindly into their own ruin. The phone call happened on a Tuesday evening. I stood in the foyer of my Tribeca penthouse, holding a bottle of 1982 Bordeaux. It was a rare vintage I sourced specifically for my parents' ruby anniversary. The phone rested on the marble console, projecting my brother Mason on speaker. He is 36, a venture capitalist who spends more time curating his tailored suits than managing actual portfolios. Elena. Mason sighed, the sound carrying a distinct layer of elitist boredom. We finalized the guest list for Greenwich this weekend. You are off it. It is an intimate family gathering. You do not fit the aesthetic we are projecting. Your presence brings down the room. Do not show up. Before I could process the sting of being erased from my own family, my mother Victoria chimed in. Her voice carried the practiced, hollow warmth she uses on country club waiters. Elena. Darling, do not take it to heart. We still expect your gift. Of course. $10,000 should cover your portion of the floral arrangements. Wire it by tomorrow morning. They waited for my reaction. They expected a plea, a tearful negotiation, or a sudden burst of anger. I gave them silence. I tapped the red end call button on my screen. I picked up the Bordeaux, walked into the kitchen, and dropped the bottle directly into the stainless steel trash bin. The dark glass shattered against the bottom. I opened my laptop and navigated to a secure travel portal. Within 3 minutes, I secured a seat on the next red-eye flight to Geneva. If my family considered me a liability, I would gladly remove myself from their hemisphere. 2 hours later, I sat in the departure lounge at John F. Kennedy International Airport. The ambient noise of the terminal faded into a low hum. I opened my encrypted tablet to clear my pending work emails before takeoff. A sharp, distinct chime cut through the quiet air. It was a high-level security alert linked to a dormant family legacy trust. My grandfather established that trust decades ago. I serve as the silent co-manager. I opened the notification log, my eyes scanning the raw financial data. Mason had bypassed the secondary firewall. He utilized a forged notarization to leverage the trust, extracting a $250,000 commercial line of credit. The destination routing number belonged to a limited liability company I did not recognize. He was not just throwing a lavish party. He was funding the chandeliers and the caviar with stolen capital. The boarding announcement for my flight echoed over the intercom. I picked up my briefcase. The trip to Switzerland was no longer a weekend escape to clear my head. It was a tactical deployment. The hunt had officially begun. Cruising altitude brought a deceptive stillness to the first-class cabin. The ambient noise of the jet engines faded into a low, steady hum. The first step in any hostile corporate takeover is creating a false sense of security in the target. I needed my family to believe their exclusionary tactics had successfully crushed my spirit. I opened a secure concierge application on my tablet and ordered an arrangement of rare white orchids to be delivered directly to the Greenwich estate. The price tag was $500. I typed a brief accompanying note, wishing them a flawless evening. It was a classic red herring. I knew my mother would place those flowers in the center of the grand foyer. She would point them out to the arriving elite guests, spinning a fabricated tale about my tragic inability to attend, masking my absence with a display of my supposed submission. They would drink vintage champagne and toast to my defeat while I sat in the darkened cabin of a transatlantic flight, systematically dismantling their future. With the diversion deployed, I turned my attention to the glaring security alert on my screen. Mason had bypassed a dormant family legacy trust. He had extracted $250,000 using a forged notarization. But financial predators rarely keep stolen capital in their own names. They layer the transactions to obscure the trail. I initiated a forensic trace on the routing numbers attached to the commercial line of credit. The digital breadcrumbs formed a clear, undeniable path. The funds bypassed Mason's venture capital firm entirely and landed in a limited liability company registered in Connecticut. I recognized the registered agent on the corporate filing immediately. Chloe, my brother's wife. Chloe operated a luxury event planning boutique, a business built more on social climbing than actual profit margins. She spent her days networking with my mother's country club peers, projecting an aristocratic lifestyle she had not earned. I pulled out my phone and logged into an untraceable secondary social media profile. Chloe was a creature of constant validation. She documented every waking moment of her life online. I found her broadcasting a live video from the center of my parents' estate. She strutted through the grand dining room, proudly showcasing the imported crystal chandeliers, the walls of fresh white roses, and the silver trays of caviar. She narrated the video with forced enthusiasm, taking credit for the opulent design. I watched the screen with clinical detachment, searching the background for anomalies. Criminals who prioritize aesthetics always neglect their perimeter security. My eyes caught a fleeting detail resting on the marble kitchen island behind her. I paused the video, captured the frame, and enhanced the image on my high-resolution monitor. It was an open portfolio containing printed invoices. The logo printed at the top of the visible document did not belong to a local catering service or a florist. It belonged to a notorious offshore holding firm operating out of the Cayman Islands. The pieces of the puzzle locked into a sinister alignment. Chloe's boutique event business was not just overpriced. It was a functioning money laundering front. Mason was using his wife's company to wash the stolen trust funds, disguising the illicit capital as exorbitant event expenses. They were literally dancing on the ashes of my grandfather's legacy. But a question remained. Why would a failing venture capitalist burn $250,000 on a single anniversary gala? The return on investment for a social gathering is zero. Mason was greedy, but he was not irrational. He needed cash to save his sinking firm. An anniversary party was a smokescreen for a much larger operation. This was not a celebration. It was a staged theatrical production designed to project extreme solvency. I breached the caterer's digital manifest to review the finalized guest list. I scrolled past the names of local politicians, minor celebrities, and country club socialites. Then a single entry halted my progress. Marcus Sterling. My breath caught in my throat for a fraction of a second. Marcus Sterling was a billionaire tech investor. He possessed a reputation for ruthlessly eviscerating fraudulent startups and destroying dishonest founders. He also happened to be the anchor client of my Manhattan liquidation firm. He trusted my analytical precision, and we had collaborated on multiple high-stakes asset seizures. Marcus despised frivolous social events. He would never attend a suburban anniversary gala unless there was a lucrative business proposition on the table. I accessed my firm's proprietary secure database. I ran a targeted query for any recent venture capital pitch decks circulating within Sterling's immediate network. The search algorithm returned a hit within 30 seconds. It was a sleek 50-page executive summary submitted by Mason's struggling firm. I bypassed the rudimentary password protection and opened the document. The title page boasted a revolutionary risk assessment algorithm designed to predict market volatility. I turned to the technical breakdown. Lines of complex code and back-end infrastructure diagrams filled the screen. A cold, heavy realization settled deep into my bones. The code staring back at me was my own. 5 years ago, during my early days as an analyst, I had written a highly sophisticated predictive algorithm. I kept it shelved, waiting for the right moment to deploy it. Mason had somehow breached an old shared home network and copied the source code. He had rebranded my intellectual property, slapping his firm's logo on the cover page. The true motive for my banishment from the Greenwich estate snapped into horrifying clarity. The insult about my corporate aesthetic was a calculated lie. Mason intended to corner Marcus Sterling at the party. He planned to use the lavish surroundings to fake financial stability and pitch the stolen algorithm. But Marcus was a veteran investor. He would demand to know the identity of the lead engineer. He would want to speak to the architect of the code. Mason's strategy was obvious. He planned to lie to the billionaire. He intended to claim that his brilliant sister, a senior liquidation specialist, was his silent partner. He would use my sterling professional reputation to legitimize his fraudulent pitch. If I had walked through the doors of that estate tonight, the entire charade would have imploded. Marcus would have approached me, asked about the algorithm, and my confusion would have exposed Mason's theft in an instant. They banished me to steal my professional legacy undisturbed. The profound sociopathic audacity of his plan required a retaliation of unprecedented magnitude. A normal sibling might call the authorities or issue an immediate cease and desist order. I closed the pitch deck and took a sip of my coffee. I decided not to intervene. I would not cancel his presentation. I would let him pitch his stolen property directly to the man I worked for. I would let my brother climb onto the highest possible pedestal because the fall from that height would be fatal. As the aircraft began its initial descent over the snow-capped Swiss Alps, the cabin pressure shifted, mirroring the tightening grip of my strategy. I opened my banking portal. I possessed the administrative credentials to the family trust he had leveraged. I initiated a silent digital freeze on the master account. The execution was meticulously timed to detonate right as the string quartet played their final set. The next phase of the operation required specialized legal leverage, and the Swiss banking sector was the perfect place to acquire it. The hunt was no longer domestic. It was a global execution. The wheels of the private jet touched down on the frozen tarmac of Geneva Airport long before the sun crested the Alpine horizon. The cabin door opened, allowing the biting Swiss wind to sweep through the aisle. I did not wear a heavy coat. The cold felt clarifying. It sharpened my focus, stripping away any lingering fatigue from the transatlantic flight. I bypassed the standard customs queue, utilizing a diplomatic fast track reserved for high-tier financial executives. Within 20 minutes, a discreet black sedan transported me deep into the heart of the city financial district. My destination was an unbranded limestone building nestled between two luxury watch boutiques. It housed one of the most exclusive wealth management firms in Europe, an institution that specialized in discreet corporate lending and secondary debt packaging. I walked through the revolving glass doors and approached the reception desk. A quiet professional escort led me to a soundproof glass conference room on the top floor. Dieter, a senior compliance officer I had collaborated with on several international liquidations, sat waiting at the head of a polished granite table. He pushed a thick leather portfolio toward my side of the desk. "We have compiled the requested ledgers," Dieter stated, his voice a low hum against the pristine silence of the room. "Your brother leveraged his venture capital firm heavily against European shadow lenders last quarter. The loans are highly toxic. He used his projected algorithm sales as collateral. Since those sales have not materialized, his firm is currently in a silent default period. The creditors are eager to offload the risk." I opened the portfolio, scanning the itemized debt obligations. Mason had borrowed an astonishing sum to keep up appearances. He financed luxury cars, leased a prime Manhattan office space, and funded his extravagant lifestyle, all while his actual investment returns flatlined. The numbers laid bare the anatomy of a failing man. He operated on the delusion that a single lucrative pitch could erase years of fiscal incompetence. "My firm possesses the liquidity to acquire this entire portfolio immediately," I replied, producing a specialized encrypted pen from my briefcase. "We will purchase the distressed debt at 40 cents on the dollar. In exchange, The master title and all immediate collection rights transfer exclusively to my holding company. Dieter nodded, sliding the transfer authorization forms across the granite. The transaction is highly unorthodox for a family member, he noted, a faint shadow of curiosity breaking his strict professional demeanor. This is not a family transaction, I corrected, signing my name with practiced fluidity. This is a hostile acquisition. The ink dried on the thick parchment. The legal machinery locked into place. I stood up, shook Dieter by the hand, and walked out of the limestone building. As I stepped onto the icy pavement, the true weight of the maneuver settled over me. I was no longer just the sister who had been banished from an anniversary party. I was officially the supreme primary creditor of my brother's entire existence. I owned the paper on his life. The second he violated a single term of those loan agreements, I held the unmitigated authority to seize his business, drain his accounts, and force him into involuntary bankruptcy. I retreated to a quiet cafe overlooking Lake Geneva. I ordered a black espresso, opened my laptop, and established a secure connection to my domestic servers. It was mid-evening back in Greenwich, Connecticut. The anniversary gala was reaching its peak. I navigated to the social media feed of my sister-in-law, Chloe. She had built a minor online following by projecting an image of effortless aristocratic grace, carefully masking the reality of her desperate social climbing. Tonight, she was treating my parents' estate like her own personal film set. Her live broadcast illuminated my screen. The lavish excess of the party was staggering. Towering arches of imported white orchids framed the grand entryway. Waiters in crisp uniforms circulated with silver trays, offering premium caviar and vintage champagne. My mother, Victoria, drifted through the crowd wearing an ostentatious emerald gown. She laughed loudly, touching the arms of local politicians and wealthy country club peers, soaking up their manufactured admiration. My father, Charles, stood near the marble fireplace, holding a snifter of expensive scotch, looking every inch the benevolent patriarch. They looked flawless. They looked untouchable. They had successfully erased their disappointing corporate daughter from the narrative, choosing instead to celebrate the illusion of their perfect family. The camera panned across the room, tracking Chloe as she strutted toward the outdoor terrace. Through the glass doors, I spotted the primary target of this entire elaborate charade. Marcus Sterling stood near a stone balustrade, isolated from the bustling crowd. He wore a simple tailored suit without a tie. He held a crystal flute, though he was not drinking. His dark eyes scanned the attendees with the detached, analytical boredom of a man who evaluated human worth in fractions of a second. Marcus was a self-made tech billionaire, a man who had clawed his way up from nothing to dominate the Silicon Valley investment sphere. He despised frivolous wealth displays and inherited privilege. He was also my most trusted client. I watched the live feed intently. Mason emerged from the crowd, making a deliberate, calculated approach toward the terrace. He adjusted the cuffs of his tuxedo, a gesture that betrayed his mounting nervous energy. He carried a sleek, silver tablet in his left hand. My brother was stepping into the lion den. He genuinely believed his slick charm and the luxurious backdrop of the gala would blind a veteran investor to the hollow reality of his pitch. He walked up to Marcus, extending a hand and flashing a bright, eager smile. Marcus accepted the handshake, his expression remaining perfectly stoic. The camera angle did not capture audio, but the body language told the entire story. Mason was speaking rapidly, gesturing toward the tablet. He tapped the screen, pulling up the presentation for the risk assessment algorithm. My algorithm. The proprietary code I had engineered during grueling night shifts 5 years ago. Mason was selling stolen intellectual property to a billionaire, attempting to secure a lifeline before his creditors realized he was insolvent. He was using the code I built to buy his way out of the disaster he created. I pulled my encrypted smartphone from my pocket. I navigated to my secure contacts and located Marcus Sterling. I did not hesitate. I pressed the call button and brought the device to my ear. The connection bridged the Atlantic Ocean, ringing directly into the pocket of the billionaire standing on my parents' terrace. On the live video feed, I saw Marcus pause. He held up a single finger, interrupting Mason mid-sentence. He retrieved his phone, glanced at the caller identification, and raised an eyebrow. He turned slightly away from my brother and brought the phone to his ear. "Elena," Marcus answered, his deep baritone carrying clearly over the encrypted line. "You have impeccable timing. I am currently enduring a rather tedious sales pitch at an anniversary gala. The hors d'oeuvres are excellent, but the company is proving to be highly redundant. I appreciate you attending." "Marcus," I replied, keeping my voice smooth and clinical. "I assume my brother is currently showing you a presentation regarding a predictive risk assessment model." "He is," Marcus confirmed. "He just referred to you as his silent subordinate. He claims you handle the minor back-end maintenance while he architects the vision. It is a bold statement considering you manage my entire liquidation portfolio." "My brother is an exceptional storyteller," I noted, taking a slow sip of my espresso. "But I must inform you that the narrative he is selling is a work of fiction. The algorithm on that tablet is my proprietary intellectual property. Mason breached a dormant family server to acquire the source code. He does not hold the patent. He does not possess the licensing rights, and he has no legal authority to distribute the software." The silence on the line grew sharp. I watched the live feed on my laptop. Marcus did not react visibly, but his posture shifted. The relaxed billionaire vanished, replaced instantly by the ruthless corporate predator who had dismantled countless fraudulent startups. "Are you informing me that I am being pitched stolen assets?" Marcus asked, his tone dropping to a dangerous, icy register. I confirmed. "Furthermore, his venture capital firm is currently insolvent. I just finalized a transaction in Geneva to acquire his entire secondary debt portfolio. He owes his European creditors $2.4 million. He utilized a forged signature to extract funds from a family legacy trust just to finance the caviar you are currently eating. If you invest a single dollar into his firm, the Securities and Exchange Commission will seize the funds the moment the ink dries on the contract." Marcus absorbed the forensic data without missing a beat. He understood the severe legal implications of engaging with a compromised entity. He recognized that Mason was attempting to use his pristine billionaire status to wash a toxic, sinking ship. "I despise thieves." "Elena," Marcus stated, his voice resonating with lethal clarity. "And I particularly despise being treated like a fool at a cocktail party." "I know you do." "Marcus," I replied, "that is why I called. Consider the contract terminated," he said. "Have your legal team draft the injunctions. I will handle the immediate feedback." Marcus ended the call. I kept my eyes locked on the live video feed streaming across my laptop. Chloe was still narrating her walk through the ballroom, but the camera remained focused on the terrace. Marcus lowered his phone and turned back to face Mason. My brother wore an eager, expectant grin, waiting for the billionaire to praise his stolen presentation. Mason extended the tablet, ready to close the deal of his lifetime. Marcus did not take the tablet. He did not smile. He simply stared at Mason with an expression of profound, unvarnished disgust. The billionaire raised his hand, holding his crystal champagne flute. He held it over the polished stone floor of the terrace and slowly, deliberately, let his fingers open. The crystal dropped. Even without audio, the visual impact of the shattering glass was catastrophic. The elegant flute exploded into hundreds of glittering fragments against the hard stone. The sudden, violent disruption severed the polite atmosphere of the gala. Guests on the terrace stopped talking. Heads turned in unison. Marcus stepped forward, invading Mason's space. He spoke directly into my brother's face. I could not hear the words, but I saw the color violently drain from Mason's cheeks. His smug confidence melted into an expression of pure, unadulterated terror. He took a stumbling step backward, nearly tripping over the shattered crystal. Marcus turned on his heel and walked straight through the center of the estate. ignoring the gasps of the wealthy onlookers. He bypassed my mother, who had rushed forward with a look of frantic concern, and marched out the front doors. The execution had commenced. The most powerful man in the room had just publicly branded my brother a fraud, setting off a chain reaction that would reduce their entire fabricated reality to ash. I closed my laptop, paid for my espresso, and prepared for the inevitable financial fallout. The guillotine was dropping, and they had no idea I held the rope. The icy alpine air of Geneva perfectly matched my internal temperature when I stepped out of the discreet corporate banking institution. I had not flown across the Atlantic Ocean to open a hidden account or hide my assets. I was there to execute a lethal corporate maneuver. Months ago, my liquidation firm quietly purchased the secondary debt portfolio of my brother's failing venture capital firm. On paper, I was already his supreme primary creditor. I sat in a sleek glass office alongside a senior Swiss compliance officer and officially authorized a debt call. In the high-stakes financial sector, a debt call is a merciless mechanism. It demands the immediate total repayment of all leveraged assets. Standard contracts offer a 30-day grace period for the debtor to secure liquidity. I utilized a specific breach of contract clause attached to fraudulent collateral to bypass that grace period entirely. By signing my name on the final line of the authorization form, I reduced the compliance window to 0 seconds. The moment the Swiss banking servers processed my signature, a catastrophic financial shockwave was dispatched directly toward the United States. Back in Connecticut, the anniversary gala was reaching its glittering crescendo. My parents were parading through their sprawling Greenwich estate, radiating unearned triumph. They were celebrating the flawless execution of their social facade, thoroughly convinced that banishing me had secured their elite status. They were popping vintage champagne and laughing at my supposed submission, while they basked in their fabricated glory. My dual monitors illuminated the dark reality of their impending doom. Through my encrypted phone, a stark notification pierced the quiet of my Swiss workspace. I received a text message from Marcus Sterling himself. The billionaire tech investor was currently standing in my parents' living room, holding a crystal flute filled with their expensive liquor. He was observing the circus with the calculating eyes of a veteran predator. His text read, "Your brother is currently pitching me your algorithm. He just called you his subordinate. Awaiting your signal." The dramatic irony was profound poetry. Mason was desperately trying to con the exact man who paid my firm millions of dollars to hunt down corporate fraudsters. My brother stood on the imported marble floors of our family estate, wearing a custom-tailored tuxedo, attempting to sell my own brain back to my top client. He genuinely believed his slick charm and the luxurious backdrop of the anniversary party would blind the billionaire to the hollow reality of his pitch. Mason thought he was securing a $5 million investment to save his sinking firm. He had no idea he was delivering a recorded confession of intellectual property theft directly to the executioner. I did not yell. I did not issue frantic threats or demand to speak to my father. I leaned back in my Swiss leather chair, resting my hands on the cool mahogany desk. I simply typed a 3-word response to the billionaire. Drop the hammer. I watched the digital tracking monitors stream the live event through the burner account I had established. Chloe, my sister-in-law, was still live streaming the gala to her thousands of followers, desperate to showcase her proximity to extreme wealth. The camera panned across the terrace, capturing the exact moment Marcus Sterling received my message. Marcus did not quietly excuse himself. He did not pull Mason aside for a discreet conversation. A man of his stature does not tolerate financial deception, and he certainly does not protect the egos of amateur thieves. Standing beneath the towering floral arches, Marcus deliberately released his grip on his champagne flute. The heavy crystal plummeted to the floor, shattering into hundreds of glittering shards. The sharp, jarring crash severed the polite atmosphere of the gala like a scalpel. The string quartet abruptly halted their melody. 200 elite guests turned their heads in unison, their conversations dying instantly in their throats. The opulent living room descended into a suffocating, breathless silence. Marcus stepped forward, invading Mason's personal space. His voice, a booming, resonant baritone, echoed off the vaulted ceilings. He did not just reject the business proposal. He methodically exposed the pitch as stolen intellectual property in front of the entire country club hierarchy. Marcus announced to the crowd of hedge fund managers, real estate tycoons, and local politicians that Mason Sinclair was a desperate fraudster operating a hollow Ponzi scheme. He publicly advised every wealthy investor in the room to audit their portfolios immediately, warning them that the man hosting this lavish event was financially contagious. Having delivered the fatal verdict, Marcus turned on his heel and walked straight out the front doors. The social carnage was instantaneous and staggering. My mother, Victoria, let out a piercing shriek. She dropped her designer clutch, her hands flying to her face as her carefully curated aristocratic facade pulverized into dust. The elite friends she had spent decades trying to impress physically backed away from her in pure revulsion. They looked at her not with sympathy, but with the cold disgust reserved for social pariahs. My father, Charles, physically recoiled. His posture, usually so rigid with patriarchal authority, collapsed. The blood drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking sickly and hollow. He stared at the shattered crystal on the floor, incapable of formulating a single word to defend his golden child. Chloe stood near the ice sculpture, her smartphone still recording the entire humiliating implosion. The live stream broadcasted the devastating scene to her followers before she finally realized the catastrophic error and frantically fumbled to shut the application off. But the internet is eternal. The digital footprint of their public slaughter was already circulating through the elite social circles of the Eastern Seaboard, sitting thousands of miles away in a quiet European office. I watched the social media fallout ripple through the network. But the social death of the Sinclair family was merely the opening act. The true danger was only just accelerating. As the wealthy guests flooded the exits, eager to distance themselves from a public scandal, the logistical reality of the gala crashed down upon my parents. The caterers, the lighting directors, and the event managers watched the attendees flee, sensing the immediate collapse of their client. The vendors approached Victoria, demanding the final payment for the evening services. On my monitor, I tracked the incoming financial queries. The debt call I had authorized in Geneva was already working its way through the international clearinghouses. It hit Mason's domestic accounts with the force of a freight train. Every single line of credit attached to his venture capital firm froze. His corporate cards were suspended. The holding accounts were locked, pending federal review. Victoria handed her premium credit card to the catering manager. He ran the magnetic strip through his portable terminal. The machine emitted a loud, sharp beep, indicating a declined transaction. She handed him another card. Declined. The florist stepped forward, presenting an invoice for the imported white orchids. Mason offered his corporate card, his hands shaking so severely he could barely hold the plastic. Declined. The vendors grew hostile. They explicitly threatened to dial the local authorities and file police reports for felony theft of services, right there in the grand foyer. I monitored the network traffic originating from the Greenwich estate. Mason retreated to his father's private study, locking the heavy oak door behind him. He opened his laptop, his keystrokes registering on my surveillance dashboard. He was hyperventilating, his heart rate likely spiking to dangerous levels. The billionaire lifeline was gone. The vendors were threatening arrest. The Swiss bank had just issued a mandatory demand for $2.4 million. He needed liquid cash instantly to stop the bleeding. He bypassed his frozen checking accounts. He ignored his suspended corporate portals. Driven by the primal terror of a cornered animal, Mason made a fatal, unrecoverable choice. My system alerts flared bright red across my screen. Mason was attempting to access our family's archived financial network. He was targeting my personal identification markers. The golden child, the brother who claimed my corporate career was a boring joke, was actively trying to breach my retirement portfolio. He was preparing to drain my funds to cover the bouncing checks of the party I was banned from attending. He was walking directly toward a digital guillotine. And he had no idea I was the one holding the release lever. The echo of shattered crystal still hung in the grand foyer. Marcus Sterling had vanished into the cold Connecticut night, leaving behind a social vacuum that rapidly filled with sheer panic. Through my encrypted monitor in Geneva, the surveillance feed from the estate painted a portrait of high society in freefall. The local politicians and hedge fund managers did not offer their sympathies to my parents. They scrambled for the coat check, eager to distance themselves from a public scandal. The valet stand outside turned into a chaotic bottleneck as 200 elite guests fought to escape the blast radius of a declared Ponzi scheme. Victoria sat slumped on the lower steps of the sweeping mahogany staircase, her imported emerald gown pooled around her knees, unheated and wrinkled. She held her head in her hands, weeping as the country club president briskly walked past her without a single glance. Charles stood frozen near the entryway. His patriarchal authority had evaporated into the thin air. The catering staff, realizing their wealthy hosts were suddenly radioactive, abandoned their silver serving trays on the dining tables. The executive chef and the floral director cornered my father. They demanded their final payments, holding up receipts from declined transactions. They pointed at the wilting white floral arches and the untouched hors d'oeuvres, promising to dial the local police precinct for felony theft of services if the invoices were not settled before midnight. Mason had barricaded himself inside the ground floor study. The heavy oak door muffled the demands of the angry vendors, but it could not block the reality of his ruin. The debt call I had authorized hours ago had successfully paralyzed his financial ecosystem. His venture capital accounts were frozen. His corporate cards yielded insufficient funds. He paced the perimeter of the Persian rug, running a trembling hand through his meticulously styled hair. His breathing grew shallow and erratic. He needed liquidity. He needed a bridge loan to silence the caterers and buy himself a few days to invent a new lie. He opened his laptop. My tracking software mapped every single keystroke. Mason navigated to a commercial lending portal. He intended to secure an emergency equity line of credit against the Greenwich estate itself. It was a desperate, amateur maneuver. The property was heavily tied to the dormant family legacy trust. To extract equity, he required the legal authorization of the trust's co-manager. That title belonged to me. Mason did not reach for his phone to call and request my consent. He believed he was the smartest man in the room, immune to the standard rules of banking. He accessed a digital contract software, uploaded the expedited mortgage application, and initiated a signature protocol. I leaned closer to my screen in Switzerland, watching his cursor hover over the authorization line. He was tracing my electronic signature. He applied my name to a fraudulent federal bank loan. He assumed the lending portal was a standard banking gateway. It was not. The domain he had accessed was a decoy server, a highly monitored honeypot established by my cybersecurity team months ago to catch illicit corporate routing. A honeypot simulates a live financial environment, mirroring real banking interfaces while operating in a closed, isolated loop. It captures metadata, device fingerprints, and keystroke dynamics. The moment he clicked submit, the trap engaged. My servers captured his internet protocol address, the geolocation data placing him inside the Greenwich study, and the exact timestamp of the forged document. Crossing state and international banking lines with a forged digital signature does not simply violate a local ordinance. It triggers the wire fraud statute under Title 18 of the United States Code, Section 1343. Furthermore, attempting to defraud a financial institution invokes Section 1344. Bank fraud? By submitting that application, Mason had just handed me a flawless, undeniable confession of 2 distinct federal felonies. I watched the system generate a synthetic approval screen. It was a phantom confirmation, designed to feed his delusion, displaying routing numbers that looked authentic but were mathematically invalid. Mason let out a long, ragged exhale. He pulled out his smartphone. A text message routed through my monitoring software. He messaged Chloe, who was currently hiding in the upstairs master suite, refusing to face the angry vendors below. Crisis averted. The cache cleared. He truly believed he had outsmarted the system. He believed the imaginary funds would hit his account by Monday morning. He was trading a temporary social crisis for a guaranteed prison sentence. As I archived the digital evidence, my private mobile device vibrated against the sleek surface of the Swiss desk. The caller identification displayed my father. I did not answer. The line clicked over to voicemail. I pressed play, listening through the speaker. Charles did not call to ask if I had heard the news. He did not ask how to fix the financial hemorrhage. He called to protect his fragile ego. His voice was thick with venom and misdirected fury. Elena, he barked, breathing heavily into the receiver. Your negative energy ruined this entire evening. You deliberately provoked Marcus Sterling before the party. Did you not? You sabotaged your brother because you are jealous of his vision. I expect you to call Mason immediately and apologize for your petty corporate games. You are a disgrace to this family's aesthetic. He hung up. He was demanding an apology from the woman who now held the deed to his ruin. I deleted the voicemail. I did not feel a trace of anger. I felt the crisp, clinical satisfaction of an auditor finalizing a terminal ledger. I opened a secure email client and began compiling the dossier. I attached the forged loan application, the server log showing Mason's device fingerprint, and the money laundering invoices Chloe had broadcasted on her livestream. I did not just send a vague complaint. I prepared an IRS Form 3949A, the official document used to report suspected tax fraud and organized evasion. I outlined the exact structure of the offshore shell companies Chloe was using to wash the stolen trust capital. I addressed the encrypted packet directly to the white-collar crime division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. I clicked send. The data payload transferred instantly, cementing their fate in the federal databases. The transmission confirmed delivery. I closed my laptop and slid it into my leather briefcase. I walked out of the corporate banking institution and stepped into the freezing alpine night. A sleek black car was waiting at the curb to transport me to the airport. I slid into the leather back seat, watching the pristine Swiss architecture glide past the tinted windows. My family had spent the evening orchestrating a lavish lie, desperate to maintain an image they could not afford. They had banished me to protect their secrets. Now, they were locked inside a mansion with angry creditors, relying on phantom money that would never arrive. The legal guillotine was raised. The blade was sharpened. And the impending sunrise on Monday morning was going to deliver a very stark, inescapable awakening. The transatlantic flight afforded me hours of uninterrupted quiet to review the architecture of my strategy. My family assumed my decision to wire the requested $10,000 anniversary gift was a gesture of meek compliance. They viewed the funds as a tribute paid to maintain my fragile connection to their elite circle. They lacked the financial literacy to comprehend the legal mechanism they had just activated. By willingly transferring capital into the limited liability company owned by my sister-in-law, I secured official standing as an injured stakeholder under federal securities regulations. That single transaction granted my corporate legal team the unmitigated authority to compel a full audit of her operational ledgers. They demanded money to assert their superiority. I handed them the exact financial instrument required to summon federal investigators to their doorstep. The $10,000 acted as a tracking beacon, embedding itself into their illicit cash flow. It illuminated the pathway between their domestic front and their offshore shell entities. The trap was legally bulletproof, sealed by their own greed. Morning sunlight pierced the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Greenwich estate, casting long shadows across the wreckage of a failed social campaign. The opulence of the weekend had soured into a tense, hostile standoff. The vendors refused to leave the property empty-handed. Wilted orchids littered the marble foyer. The executive chef and the event coordinator stood near the kitchen island, their postures rigid, holding wireless payment terminals. Chloe clutched her smartphone. Her manicured fingers trembled slightly as she assured them the emergency funds had cleared over the weekend. She retrieved her premium black card and swiped it through the reader. The terminal processed the request. A stark decline notification flashed across the small digital screen. The machine emitted a sharp, high-pitched tone that echoed against the vaulted ceilings of the foyer. Chloe forced a nervous smile. Blaming a routing delay with her primary bank, she produced a second card from her designer wallet. An exclusive titanium card that usually commanded respect. Declined. Her breathing hitched. She tried a third piece of plastic. Declined. The approval screen Mason had stared at on Saturday night was a phantom interface. The cash did not exist. The caterer crossed his arms, stepping into her personal space. The deferential service worker vanished, replaced by a frustrated vendor demanding his livelihood. He informed her that local law enforcement responds swiftly to felony theft of services, especially when the total bill exceeds $50,000. He pulled his phone from his apron pocket and dialed the precinct. The aristocratic facade Chloe had spent years cultivating crumbled into raw panic as the dispatcher answered the call. While Chloe faced the threat of immediate arrest, my mother attempted a desperate social triage. Victoria sat in the sunlit dining room of the prestigious local country club, surrounded by influential peers. She wore her finest pearls, sipping Earl Grey tea from fine china. She spun a fabricated narrative about the tech billionaire departing the gala early due to a sudden illness. She projected fragile elegance, hoping to smooth over the bizarre conclusion to her party. My firm audits the financial board of this exact country club. The executives managing the club accounts had received the same fraud alerts bouncing across the banking network earlier that morning. The general manager strode across the dining room, flanked by 2 security personnel. The ambient chatter of the wealthy patrons ceased. The room fell into a heavy, expectant silence. The manager stopped directly at the table of my mother. He did not lower his voice to spare her feelings. He stated clearly that her membership was revoked, effective immediately. He cited severely overdrawn accounts and the public disturbance at her residence. Victoria grasped her chest, her breathing turning shallow. Her wealthy companions averted their eyes, physically shifting their chairs away from her table to avoid association. She was escorted toward the service exit. Through the large bay windows, she watched a commercial tow truck secure the front axle of her leased luxury sport utility vehicle. Her armor dissolved into a weeping, pathetic spectacle. Panic breeds cannibalism among the greedy. Mason paced the floor of his leased Manhattan office. The walls were shrinking. Chloe burst through the doors. Abandoning her usual poised demeanor, her designer trench coat hung loosely over her shoulders. She hurled her purse onto his desk, screaming about the police officers who had just visited the estate to take statements from the vendors. She demanded the funds he had promised. Mason ran a hand over his face. His complexion was ashen. He admitted the money was gone. The bridge loan had failed. With the authorities circling, Mason made a chilling pivot, showcasing the depth of his narcissism. He looked at the woman he married, the partner in his superficial empire, and demanded she liquidate her event planning business. He needed her to sell her remaining assets, drain her business accounts, and pawn her inventory to cover his fraudulent tracks. He told her it was her duty as a wife to absorb the financial blow. Chloe stared at him, her ambition colliding with his cowardice. She built her brand on the illusion of perfection. Liquidating her company meant public admission of failure, a permanent stain on her reputation. She refused. The argument escalated into a venomous exchange of blame. She threatened to expose his offshore accounts to the very vendors threatening her with arrest. He threatened to implicate her directly in the money laundering scheme, reminding her that her signature was on the corporate filings. The marriage fractured irreparably in that sterile office, dissolving into a bitter standoff between 2 cornered predators. They were out of time. The local authorities were actively drafting arrest warrants for the unpaid invoices. The federal agencies were processing the extensive tax evasion dossier I had transmitted from Geneva. Their social circle had banished them, severing any potential avenues for private loans. Lacking any remaining credit lines, their desperation overrode their carefully maintained pride. They needed a multi-million-dollar lifeline to prevent imminent incarceration and homelessness. They needed the very person they had deemed unworthy of their aesthetic. I sat behind my massive walnut desk in my Manhattan corporate headquarters, analyzing the final asset seizure protocols. The city skyline stretched out behind me, a grid of rules and consequences. The private line on my desk console illuminated. The caller identification displayed the number of my mother. I watched the blinking light, feeling the profound weight of the impending conversation. The trap was ready for the final act. Monday morning arrived with the brutal, unforgiving weight of financial reality. The dawn light hitting the Connecticut estate offered no warmth to the inhabitants inside. Mason had slept for a few hours, swaddled in the profound delusion that his digital forgery had saved his sinking ship. He believed the portal I designed was a legitimate secondary lending gateway. He thought he had successfully extracted $150,000 in liquid equity to silence the screaming vendors. He was fundamentally wrong. The account he breached was loaded entirely with synthetic tracking data, a digital mirage engineered solely to record his Internet Protocol address and secure his federal indictment. Downstairs in the grand foyer, the aftermath of the disastrous anniversary gala lingered like a fresh crime scene. The luxury florist, the executive catering director, and the lighting coordinators had returned at 8 in the morning. They did not arrive with polite inquiries. They arrived with the uncompromising posture of business owners who suspected they were being defrauded. Chloe descended the mahogany staircase, wearing a designer silk robe, attempting to project the untouchable aura of a wealthy socialite managing a minor clerical delay. She assured the furious contractors that the emergency bridge loan had cleared over the weekend. She promised the funds were ready for immediate disbursement. Chloe approached the marble kitchen island, retrieving her premium black credit card. The catering director handed her the wireless payment terminal. His face was carved from stone, devoid of the deference he had shown just 48 hours prior. Chloe swiped the magnetic strip. The machine processed the request for 10 agonizing seconds. A stark decline notification flashed across the small digital screen, accompanied by a sharp, humiliating beep. Chloe offered a tight, dismissive laugh, blaming a temporary routing error with her primary bank. She pulled a titanium card from her wallet, the one tied to Mason's venture capital firm. She swiped it through the reader. The terminal beeped again. Declined. The aristocratic facade shattered in an instant. The vendors closed ranks. Their patience entirely evaporated. The florist informed Chloe that the floral arrangements alone cost $30,000, and local law enforcement treated unpaid balances of that magnitude as felony theft of services. The catering director pulled out his phone and explicitly threatened to dial the local police precinct right there in the kitchen. Chloe scrambled backward, her manicured hands trembling as she dialed Mason. The man who claimed my corporate career was a boring joke was currently hiding in the master bedroom, paralyzed by the realization that his stolen money was a phantom glitch. The pristine image of the Sinclair family disintegrated before noon, leaving them trapped in a mansion surrounded by creditors demanding their livelihoods. While the Greenwich estate descended into localized panic, my mother deployed a different survival strategy across town. Victoria sat in the sunlit dining room of the prestigious Greenwich Country Club. This institution was a fortress of old money, a place where generational wealth dictated the social hierarchy and financial instability was treated as an infectious disease. Victoria was hosting a desperate damage control brunch with 4 of her most influential peers. She wore her finest pearls and a tailored pastel suit, projecting a fragile yet resolute aristocratic front. Through my secure terminal in Manhattan, I monitored the unfolding disaster. My liquidation firm audited the financial board of that exact country club. I had direct access to their internal flagging system. The federal alerts generated by the honeypot trap and the subsequent investigations had already pinged the accounting department of the club. The executives managing the member accounts were staring at the same catastrophic data I was viewing. They saw the severely overdrawn balances, the suspended credit lines, and the imminent federal warrants circling the Sinclair name. Victoria leaned over her porcelain teacup, weaving an elaborate lie for her skeptical audience. She claimed the sudden departure of the tech billionaire on Saturday night was due to a mild health emergency. She laughed softly, waving her hand as if the ruined gala was merely a minor bump in an otherwise flawless social season. Her friends smiled thinly, sipping their mimosas, their eyes darting around the dining room. They smelled the blood in the water. The graceful ambiance of the brunch was abruptly severed. The general manager of the country club strode purposefully across the dining room. He did not walk alone. 2 uniformed security guards flanked him, their presence casting a heavy, undeniable shadow over the table. The quiet clinking of silverware and hushed conversations around the room ceased entirely. The elite patrons turned their heads, their focus locking onto the unfolding spectacle. The manager stopped directly in front of Victoria. He did not lean down. He did not lower his voice to spare her pride. He stood tall, ensuring his words carried over the fine china and crystal glasses. "Victoria Sinclair," he announced, his tone clinical and unyielding. "Your membership is permanently revoked." Victoria gasped, her hand flying to her chest. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with shock, searching for a trace of a misunderstanding. She demanded an explanation, her voice pitching upward in a frantic attempt to retain her authority. The manager did not flinch. He recited the facts with devastating precision. The revocation is due to severely overdrawn accounts, bounced checks issued to this establishment, and the highly public disturbance at your estate. You no longer meet the financial or ethical requirements of this institution. You must vacate the premises immediately. The sheer psychological destruction of that moment was a masterpiece of social execution. The women sitting at the table with my mother physically shifted their chairs backward, creating a visible distance between themselves and the disgraced matriarch. They looked at her with pure, unvarnished revulsion. Victoria was no longer the queen of their social circle. She was a destitute fraudster, and they were eager to watch her fall. Tears welled in the eyes of my mother, ruining her meticulous makeup. She stood up on shaky legs, grabbing her designer handbag. She tried to maintain a shred of dignity, lifting her chin as she turned toward the grand front entrance. The manager raised a hand, blocking her path. He informed her that revoked members were not permitted to use the main lobby. He gestured toward the swinging doors leading to the kitchen. Escorted by the security guards, my mother was marched through the bustling industrial kitchen. Line cooks and dishwashers stopped their work, watching the weeping woman in pearls stumble past the stainless steel prep stations. It was a staggering plunge from the pinnacle of high society to the grease-stained service corridor. The service exit doors pushed open, depositing Victoria onto the harsh concrete of the rear loading dock. The frigid Connecticut air hit her tear-stained face. She looked up, expecting to find her leased luxury vehicle waiting in the parking lot. Instead, she witnessed the final, catastrophic blow to her fabricated reality. A heavy-duty federal tow truck was idling directly in front of her parking space. A repossession agent was securing thick steel chains around the front axle of her pristine Porsche Cayenne. The leasing company, alerted by the widespread financial freeze, had issued an immediate recovery order. Victoria stood on the loading dock, paralyzed by the sheer totality of her ruin. The hydraulic lift whirred to life, hoisting the front wheels of her prized vehicle into the air. The truck pulled away, dragging the last symbol of her unearned status down the street and out of sight. She was stranded on the concrete, stripped of her membership, her transportation, and her pride. She had excluded her own daughter to maintain a flawless aesthetic. And now she was standing next to a dumpster, crying hysterically while the kitchen staff watched through the small glass windows of the service doors. The financial isolation was absolute. Mason was trapped in a mansion with vendors threatening jail time. Chloe was facing the collapse of her laundering front. Victoria was marooned at a country club she could never enter again. Their arrogant kingdom had burned to the ground in less than 72 hours. Sitting in my corner office overlooking the New York skyline, I watched the final tracking alert confirm the repossession of the vehicle. The board was cleared. They possessed zero liquid capital, zero credit, and zero social leverage. Their desperation had reached its absolute peak. They had only one remaining avenue for survival, one last person they could try to manipulate to save themselves from drowning. The phone on my walnut desk remained silent for now, but I knew the call was coming. They were about to dial the exact woman they had banished, hoping to extract a miraculous bailout from a daughter they deemed unworthy. They were preparing to beg for mercy from the executioner. I took a slow sip of my coffee, turning my gaze to the city below, ready to answer their frantic pleading with a lesson in terminal velocity. Exactly 7 days had passed since Mason informed me I did not fit the aesthetic of our family. I sat behind my expansive walnut desk on the top floor of my Manhattan high-rise. The city stretched out beyond the floor to ceiling glass, a sprawling grid of concrete, ambition, and ruthless consequences. My office was a sanctuary of calculated silence. The only sound was the faint rustle of heavy bond paper as I reviewed the final asset seizure protocols prepared by my corporate legal team. The portfolios detailed the systematic dismantling of the Sinclair estate. The data painted a beautiful, irrefutable picture of impending foreclosure. I held a silver pen, tracking the liquidation metrics, feeling a profound sense of equilibrium. The chaos I engineered from Geneva was operating flawlessly across state lines. The trap had closed. Then, the private line on my desk console illuminated. Very few people possessed that specific number. I pressed the flashing button and engaged the speakerphone. I expected a routine update from my Swiss compliance officer confirming the debt transfer. Instead, the sterile air of my office was pierced by the sound of raw, unfiltered hysteria. It was Victoria. The polished aristocratic pretension she wore like armor had vanished entirely. Her voice was a ragged, high-pitched wail of a cornered animal realizing the cage was locked. "Elena," she sobbed, struggling to pull oxygen into her lungs. "Elena, please pick up the phone. You have to help us." I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair. I did not offer a greeting. I did not validate her panic with a response. I just let her weep into the digital void, allowing her desperation to echo off my glass walls. Mason made a terrible mistake, my mother continued, her words tumbling over each other in sheer terror. "The vendors are filing lawsuits right now. The leasing companies towed the cars this morning while I was at the club. The bank called your father, and they are threatening immediate foreclosure on the Greenwich house. We have nothing left. You have to fix this. We are family. Elena, you have to wire us $300,000 right now." Before I could formulate a response to her breathtaking delusion, another voice breached the connection. Charles was pacing in the background. His usual booming authority was fractured, replaced by the frantic barking of a man losing his empire in real time. "Tell her to transfer the liquid cash by noon." My father bellowed through the speaker, his heavy footsteps audible over the line. "Tell her it is her duty to protect the family name. She owes us that much." Hearing his demands for familial duty triggered a sharp, visceral memory. The polished glass walls of my Manhattan suite melted away, replaced by the dark oak paneling of his home study exactly 10 years ago. I was 24 years old, standing in front of his oversized mahogany desk holding a meticulously organized binder. I had humbled myself that day. I presented a detailed business proposal requesting a $10,000 loan to cover the tuition for my advanced financial certifications. It was a rigorous program that would guarantee my entry into elite private equity circles. I showed him the projected return on investment. I promised to pay back every cent with interest within 2 years. Charles did not even open the binder. He held a crystal tumbler of scotch. the ice clinking softly as he swirled the amber liquid. He picked up my proposal with his thumb and index finger, treating the hours of my hard work like a piece of garbage. He dropped it directly into his metal wastebasket. The sound of the heavy paper hitting the bottom of the bin echoed in my ears. He looked at me with an expression of profound boredom. "Do not embarrass this family with your cheap accounting jokes." "Elena," he sneered, taking a slow sip of his drink. "You lack the pedigree for high finance? Go find a nice middle management job and leave the real wealth building to your brother." That rejection had been the ultimate catalyst. It stripped away my naive desire for parental validation and replaced it with an unyielding, surgical focus. I learned to sever sentimentality and operate purely on logic. He denied me $10,000 to build my future. Now, a decade later, he was commanding me to hand over $300,000 to save his fraudulent past. He expected the daughter he discarded to serve as his financial shield. I returned my attention to the blinking light on my phone console. The weeping on the other end of the line reached a fever pitch. Victoria begged again, her voice cracking under the strain of her evaporating social status. "Elena, are you there? Please say you will wire the funds. The police might come to the house. You cannot let them take your brother." I did not raise my voice. I did not express a single ounce of anger or vindictive joy. I picked up my porcelain mug and took a slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee. The bitter roast washed over my tongue, a grounding sensation amidst her theatrical breakdown. "Family," I replied. My tone echoed with lethal, clinical precision. The line grew dead silent. Victoria held her breath, waiting for the lifeline she felt entitled to receive. "I was explicitly informed last week that I do not fit the aesthetic of your family," I stated, enunciating each syllable so the words would carve themselves into her memory. "You banished me from your anniversary gala to protect your image. You demanded I wire a $10,000 gift while shutting the door in my face. Now, you are asking a complete stranger for a multi-million-dollar bailout. Do we even know each other?" Victoria gasped. The sound was sharp, a sudden realization that the daughter she cast aside had just permanently closed the vault. "But, Elena, wait," she pleaded, her voice dropping into a desperate whisper. "You do not understand what is happening." "I understand the math flawlessly," I countered. "The equation is balanced." Before she could utter another manipulative shriek, I reached forward and pressed the end call button. The connection severed. The office returned to its pristine, untouchable quiet. The psychological destruction was officially complete. I had fed their toxic ideology right back to them, sealing their financial tomb with their own exclusionary words. I picked up my silver pen and signed the final authorization on the asset seizure protocol. The legal warfare was about to breach their front doors. However, a predator never rests on a single victory. The ecosystem of a collapsing fraud ring is highly volatile. Desperation breeds betrayal, and the rats always attempt to flee a sinking ship. As I filed the seizure paperwork into my outbox, the secure intercom on my desk chimed. My executive assistant rarely interrupted my blocked schedule unless the situation required immediate tactical intervention. I tapped the receiver. "Yes, Monsieur Sinclair?" my assistant said, her voice tight with professional urgency. "Building security is holding an individual in the main lobby." She bypassed the standard visitor protocols, claiming a severe family emergency. "She insists she possesses critical documentation regarding your brother's offshore accounts. She says she needs to negotiate terms before the federal warrants drop." I narrowed my eyes, calculating the sudden shift on the board. A new player had just entered the kill zone. "Who is holding in the lobby?" I asked. "It is Chloe," my assistant confirmed. The golden child's wife had defected. The criminal alliance was fracturing under the pressure of the federal investigation. Chloe realized Mason was taking her down with him, and she had just brought her secrets directly to the architect of his demise. I instructed the lobby detail to bypass the standard visitor screening and escort my sister-in-law directly to the 50th floor. The transition from digesting my mother's hysterical sobbing to intercepting a fleeing conspirator required a swift mental pivot. Chloe had manipulated the ground floor guards by faking a severe medical emergency, clutching her chest and claiming she needed a private, secure location to contact her physician. It was a clever, desperate maneuver from a woman who understood that time was a luxury she no longer possessed. I picked up a fresh legal pad and walked down the corridor. The glass walls of the conference room offered zero privacy. It was a deliberate architectural choice designed to strip away the comfort of shadows and unnerve hostile negotiators. Chloe sat at the far end of the long mahogany table. Just 3 weeks ago, she had stood in my foyer, looking me up and down with thinly veiled contempt. She had mocked my tailored workwear while draped in custom haute couture, eager to secure her place in the elite social hierarchy. Today, the arrogant influencer persona was dead. She wore a beige trench coat that hung awkwardly on her frame. The belt knotted too tight around her waist. Her usually flawless hair was pulled into a severe, messy knot. She clutched a designer handbag against her chest as if the leather could shield her from an impending federal indictment. The woman who built a digital brand broadcasting imported caviar and crystal chandeliers was currently shivering under the sterile glow of fluorescent office lights. She was highly ambitious, heavily obsessed with maintaining an aristocratic status among the country club elite. But she was not unintelligent. Her fierce self-preservation instincts had kicked in the moment those premium credit cards declined at the Greenwich estate. She recognized the sinking ship. And more importantly, she realized exactly who Mason had tied to the anchor. I took the seat opposite her. I did not offer coffee. I did not offer a comforting greeting. I simply placed my hands on the table and waited for the silence to force her hand. Chloe leaned forward, her breathing shallow and erratic. Mason lied to me, she stammered. Her voice lacked the curated, melodic tone she used for her online followers. It was raw, grounded in primal fear. He told me the event planning business was just a tax write-off. He said routing the capital through my holding company was standard venture capital structuring to avoid heavy capital gains. I let her speak, analyzing the narrative she was attempting to construct to save her own skin. I knew exactly what Mason had done. He had funneled the stolen legacy trust funds directly into her company, generating phantom invoices for floral arrangements and catering services to wash the money clean. He made her the sole registered agent on the corporate filings. When the Internal Revenue Service traced the wire fraud, the digital roadmap would end directly at her doorstep, shielding him from the primary fallout. If the feds audit those ledgers, I go to prison, Chloe whispered, a single tear cutting a track through her foundation. I have a clean record. Elena, I grew up with nothing. I worked too hard to build a life just to take the fall for your brother's incompetence. He is planning to leave the country tonight. He told me to stay behind and handle the angry vendors while he secured our offshore accounts. She unclasped her handbag. With trembling fingers, she withdrew a stack of 3 metallic external hard drives and slid them across the smooth mahogany surface. They stopped inches from my hands. I brought you everything, she offered, her eyes pleading for a lifeline. I backed up his home office workstation before I left the house. I have his master passwords. I have the offshore routing numbers tied to the Cayman accounts. I even have the direct text message logs between Mason and your father proving Charles orchestrated the entire cover-up. I will hand over the decryption keys right now. She leaned closer, lowering her voice to a desperate hush. Just grant me federal immunity. Protect me from the audits, and I will hand you the blade to cut off his head. I looked at the woman attempting to bargain her way out of a felony charge. I did not feel a shred of pity for her impending downfall. She had gleefully spent stolen money to elevate her own status, turning a blind eye to the source of the capital until the consequences arrived at her door. However, I recognized a high-value tactical asset sitting on my conference table. The text logs implicating my father were the exact leverage I needed to execute a clean sweep of the Sinclair estate. The hard drives were a golden ticket. But her terms were built on a fundamental misunderstanding of the justice system. I rested my forearms on the table, interlocking my fingers. I am a liquidation specialist. Chloe, I stated flatly, my tone dropping the temperature in the room. I dismantle bankrupt corporations and seize distressed assets. I do not grant federal immunity. You watch too many procedural television dramas. The Department of Justice does not negotiate with private equity executives regarding criminal pardons. Chloe opened her mouth, the fragile hope she had carried into the building fracturing across her face. But you have connections, she protested, her voice spiking in panic. You filed the honeypot traps. You notified the authorities. You have to save me. I raised a single finger, silencing her outburst before it could escalate into a tantrum. I do not offer immunity, I clarified, maintaining an unwavering gaze. I offer a non-disclosure and cooperation agreement. My lead corporate attorney spent a decade working as a federal prosecutor for the Southern District of New York. He knows exactly how the white-collar crime division operates, and he maintains direct channels to the investigating agents. I outlined the brutal mechanics of the deal. You will sign your entire limited liability company over to my firm today. You will relinquish all equity, forfeit your physical assets, and transfer the master operating rights to me. In exchange, my attorney will act as your legal intermediary. He will hand this state evidence directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and negotiate leniency on your behalf in exchange for your full, unredacted cooperation. It was a non-negotiable ultimatum. She was trading her fabricated luxury empire for a chance to avoid wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. I slid a sleek, black folder across the glass. Inside lay the asset transfer documents, drafted, formatted, and ready for execution. Sign them, I instructed, tapping the dotted line with my silver pen. Or take your hard drives and try your luck walking through airport security with a man who just booked a one-way ticket using stolen funds. Chloe did not hesitate. Her survival instinct overrode any lingering loyalty to the Sinclair name or her marriage vows. She picked up the pen and signed her name on every page, her signature a frantic, messy scroll. With those strokes of ink, she permanently betrayed her husband. She legally finalized his criminal fate while simultaneously rendering herself entirely destitute. She pushed the signed contracts back toward me, stood up on shaking legs, and gathered her trench coat. She walked out of the conference room, a hollow ghost of her former self, stripped of her company, her marriage, and her unearned wealth. I gathered the encrypted drives, sliding them securely into my briefcase. The digital blueprint of my father's complicity was now safely in my possession. The operation was advancing flawlessly, shifting the power dynamic irreversibly in my favor. Arrogant men despise being outmaneuvered. They lash out when cornered, relying on intimidation when their financial shields evaporate. As I locked my briefcase, my desk console flared to life again. My security chief spoke through the speaker, his voice tight with warning. The lobby perimeter had just been breached. Charles Sinclair had stormed through the revolving doors, shoving his way past the turnstiles, demanding blood. The patriarch had arrived. The security alert on my monitor blinked a silent warning just seconds before the heavy glass doors of my executive suite shuddered under a heavy impact. Charles Sinclair did not believe in waiting rooms. He operated under the lifelong delusion that closed doors and reception desks applied only to the working class. He was a man whose family name had graced the rosters of elite country clubs for 3 generations. A man who navigated the world expecting immediate deference. Today, however, he looked nothing like the polished aristocrat who had banished me from his anniversary gala just a week prior. He shoved his way past my 2 bewildered executive assistants, his wingtip shoes thudding a chaotic rhythm against the hardwood floor. I sat back in my ergonomic leather chair and watched the patriarch of the Sinclair family unravel in real time. His custom-tailored suit was rumpled. A sheen of nervous sweat coated his forehead, and his complexion burned a mottled, unhealthy shade of crimson. He was suffocating under the rapidly collapsing weight of his own hubris. Yet he clung desperately to the belief that he could intimidate his way out of a federal crisis. He stopped at the edge of my walnut desk. He planted his hands firmly on the pristine glass surface, leaning his entire body weight forward to cast a shadow over my workspace. The veins in his neck pulsed with unchecked fury. He raised a shaking hand, pointing his index finger directly at my face. "You ungrateful, vindictive wretch," Charles roared. His voice bounced off the soundproof partitions. Harsh, frantic, and stripped of all its usual refined composure. "You think you can freeze your brother's accounts and steal his business. You think you can humiliate your mother and tear down this family's legacy over a petty grudge. I will sue this firm into the ground. I will drag you through a decade of litigation. I will personally ensure you are permanently disbarred from the financial sector. You will never work in this city again." I did not flinch. I did not stand up. I did not offer him a single micro-expression of fear or submission. A seasoned liquidation specialist knows that when a cornered debtor resorts to screaming about lawsuits, it signifies they have run out of actual capital. He had no money left to retain a defense attorney, let alone fund a prolonged corporate legal battle. His threats were empty cartridges, fired from a jammed weapon. I took a slow breath, letting the sterile, climate-controlled air of the high-rise fill my lungs. I looked at the man who had thrown my graduate school application into a wastebasket 10 years ago. The father who had laughed at my ambitions and told me to find a middle management job. "You are not going to sue anyone, Charles," I stated. My tone dropped to a chilling, level register that cut right through his bluster. "You cannot afford the filing fees. My holding company just seized the deed to your Greenwich estate. The bank repossessed your vehicles. The country club terminated your membership this morning. You are currently standing in my office, wearing a suit you can no longer afford to dry clean." He opened his mouth to shout another threat, a desperate attempt to regain control of the narrative. I raised my hand, silencing him with a sharp, decisive gesture. Furthermore, I continued, my voice echoing with lethal precision, "You cannot sue a whistleblower for reporting a documented felony. Your daughter-in-law sat in that exact guest chair 15 minutes ago. She traded her loyalty for a cooperation agreement. I possess the encrypted hard drives. I have the unredacted text logs between you and Mason. I read the specific messages where you instructed your son to wash the stolen legacy trust funds through her event planning boutique to hide the deficit from the regulatory agencies." Charles stopped breathing. His jaw went slack. The furious red flush drained entirely from his face, replaced by a sickly, translucent pallor. The booming arrogance evaporated into the chilled air. He realized I did not just freeze an account. I had mapped the entire anatomy of his criminal enterprise. The daughter he deemed unworthy of the Sinclair aesthetic had just reverse-engineered his financial ruin. He tried to swallow, his throat bobbing nervously. He lowered his pointing hand, his fingers twitching as they brushed against the fabric of his trousers. "Elena," he stammered. His voice lost its commanding baritone, cracking into a pathetic, reedy rasp. "You misunderstood those messages. It was a temporary bridge loan. We were going to replace the capital. You cannot hand those drives to the authorities. It will destroy the Sinclair name forever. The Sinclair name is already dead," I replied, maintaining unbroken eye contact. "I am just burying the corpse." I did not wait for his next pathetic excuse. I reached toward the edge of my desk console and pressed a small, unassuming silver button. The lock on the door to my adjacent private suite disengaged with a sharp metallic click. The heavy oak door swung open, and the atmosphere in the executive suite shifted from a tense family dispute to a lethal law enforcement operation. Two imposing figures stepped out of the private office. They did not wear the standard gray suits of corporate security. They wore dark tactical vests bearing the distinct, unmistakable silver badges of United States Marshals. They moved with a synchronized, hypervigilant discipline, stepping directly into my father's peripheral vision. Charles froze, his entire body locked into a rigid state of paralysis. He stared at the badges gleaming under the recessed overhead lighting. The man who firmly believed his generational wealth granted him permanent immunity was suddenly standing face to face with the inescapable reality of the federal justice system. His prestigious country club connections and his country estate could not shield him from the individuals standing in my office. The lead marshal, a tall man with a stern, unforgiving expression, stepped forward. He bypassed all social pleasantries, moving straight to the execution of his duty. He held a thick, sealed manila envelope in his right hand. "Charles Sinclair," the marshal announced. His voice commanded the room, leaving zero space for debate, negotiation, or familial manipulation. "You are hereby served with a federal subpoena." He pressed the heavy envelope directly into my father's chest. Charles instinctively brought his shaking hands up to grasp it, holding the document as if it were a live explosive device ready to detonate. The charges include conspiracy to commit wire fraud and gross tax evasion. The marshal continued, reciting the facts with cold, clinical efficiency. "You are ordered to surrender your passport to the federal court by 5:00 this evening. All remaining personal and corporate assets linked to your Social Security number are officially frozen, pending a grand jury indictment. If you attempt to flee the jurisdiction, an arrest warrant will be executed immediately." My father looked down at the sealed envelope. His hands shook so severely the thick paper rattled. His knees physically buckled under the crushing weight of the law. He stumbled backward, his legs hitting the edge of the leather guest chair. He collapsed into the seat, his posture folding inward. The arrogant patriarch who had banished me from his anniversary gala, the man who had called my profession a cheap joke, was now a trembling, broken suspect staring down a decade behind bars. He was trapped, grounded, and entirely neutralized. But the Sinclair family rot ran deep, and a cornered rat will always search for a sewer grate. While Charles sat paralyzed in my office, stripped of his passport and his pride, a secondary alert flared on my tracking monitor. Mason, realizing his father had walked into a trap and his wife had vanished, was making a desperate, cowardly play. His digital footprint pinged at an international departure terminal. The golden child was attempting to flee the country, entirely unaware that his escape route had already been boarded up. Which brings us directly back to the catastrophic scene unfolding inside John F. Kennedy International Airport. Mason had panicked. The sudden disappearance of his wife, combined with the news of the federal subpoena served to our father, obliterated whatever remained of his composure. He chose the ultimate cowardly route. He stuffed a designer duffel bag with thousands of dollars in loose cash scrounged from his office safe. Alongside his collection of luxury watches, he purchased a last-minute, first-class ticket to Dubai, a destination he naively believed would shield him from American law enforcement. He severely underestimated the airtight perimeter I had constructed. During my trip to Geneva, when I acquired his primary debt portfolio, my corporate legal team filed an emergency flight risk injunction attached to his passport number. We established that he was actively liquidating assets while under investigation for wire fraud. The federal court placed his name on the Department of Homeland Security Border Monitoring Registry. The moment he checked in for his flight, the system alerted the local field office. Mason stood at the priority security lane, wearing a dark baseball cap pulled low over his eyes and a designer jacket. He projected a calm demeanor, thoroughly convinced his wealth and privilege would carry him past the TSA checkpoint. He handed his passport to the officer behind the podium. The agent swiped the document through the optical scanner. The digital display immediately flashed a bright red alert banner. High-pitched security alarms echoed through the terminal. The TSA officer stepped back, placing his hand on his holster while signaling his supervisor. Mason realized the trap had sprung. His face flushed white. He abandoned his duffel bag, spun on his heel, and attempted to sprint back toward the crowded departure hall. He managed 6 frantic strides before 3 armed customs and border protection officers converged on his position. The lead officer delivered a precise, heavy tackle, driving Mason straight down onto the polished concrete floor. The impact knocked the breath from his lungs. His baseball cap tumbled across the tile. Dozens of international travelers pulled out their smartphones, recording the brutal, chaotic arrest from every angle. Mason struggled against the overwhelming physical force, whining in pain as an officer pinned his shoulders down and wrenched his arms behind his back. The steel handcuffs clicked, locked around his wrists. A stern agent read him his Miranda rights into his ear, his voice cutting through the noise of the terminal. They hoisted my brother to his feet. His bespoke jacket was ripped at the seam, covered in floor dust, his hair messy, and tears streaming down his face. The golden child of the Sinclair family, the man who had dismissed my career as a boring corporate joke, was being paraded through the terminal like a common criminal. Passengers cheered and filmed as the officers marched him through the security doors toward an awaiting federal transport vehicle. An hour later, the administrative machinery of the penal system erased his identity. They stripped him of his tailored clothes, his leather shoes, and his expensive rings. They issued him a coarse, bright orange jumpsuit and rubber sandals. They processed his fingerprints into the national database and led him down a cold corridor into a windowless federal holding cell. Inside the detention center, Mason lost his mind. He gripped the heavy steel bars, his knuckles turning white, screaming at the top of his lungs for his mother to come bail him out. He demanded to speak to a high-powered defense attorney, completely ignorant of the reality that every single bank account associated with his name was frozen. He had zero liquid capital. He had no social leverage. He had nowhere left to run. Sitting back in my Manhattan penthouse, I watched a viral video clip uploaded by a traveler at JFK. The video showed my brother eating airport dust while being handcuffed. The clip already had 2 million views. I took a slow sip of my tea, completely unmoved by his public execution. The brother who had banished me to protect an aesthetic was now the face of a viral federal takedown. My phone chimed with an incoming notification from the United States Attorney Office for the Southern District of New York. A prosecutor requested my presence at the federal courthouse the following morning. They needed the primary victim of the identity theft and wire fraud to review the formal indictment papers before the grand jury session. The legal machinery was moving forward. The golden child was locked behind bars. My father was stripped of his passport, and my sister-in-law had surrendered her assets. But the final act of this corporate war required a face-to-face confrontation inside the belly of the beast. Tomorrow morning, I would walk into the federal courthouse, sit across a metal table from my caged brother, and hand him the ultimate, undeniable proof of his total destruction. The federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan operates as a grim equalizer, stripping away all illusions of wealth the moment a suspect crosses the threshold. The interrogation room located in the subterranean holding sector offered zero natural light. A single rectangular fluorescent fixture buzzed overhead, casting a harsh, sickly pale glow over a scratched metal table bolted directly to the concrete floor. The air smelled faintly of industrial bleach and stale coffee. Mason sat in a rigid aluminum chair, his posture folded inward. The man who routinely spent $10,000 on bespoke Italian tailoring now wore a stiff, unwashed orange jumpsuit. The rough fabric hung loose on his frame, the bright color highlighting his ashen complexion. He shivered continuously. The climate control system pumped chilled air through a ceiling vent, a deliberate tactic used by investigators to maintain psychological discomfort. Deprived of his cashmere overcoats and his sycophantic entourage, my brother looked incredibly small. 2 veteran agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation sat across from him. They did not shout. They did not perform the theatrical interrogation seen in popular media. They employed the most effective weapon in federal law enforcement. They used silence. The lead investigator, a gray-haired man holding a thick manila folder, methodically flipped through pages of forensic accounting printouts, letting the psychological weight of the windowless room press down on his suspect. Mason slammed his palms against the metal table, the sudden noise echoing sharply in the confined space. He demanded a phone call to his retained legal counsel. He rattled off the name of a prestigious white-collar defense firm located on Wall Street, a firm known for charging $1,500 an hour. He threatened the agents with civil rights lawsuits, insisting his detention at the airport was a catastrophic administrative error that would cost them their pensions. He demanded respect. He demanded a glass of sparkling water. The lead investigator did not look up from his paperwork. He turned a page, the sound crisp in the quiet room. He simply stated that the named law firm had formally declined representation 48 minutes prior. The investigator informed Mason that the required retaining fee had bounced. Every domestic checking account, every offshore holding company, and every hidden line of credit tied to the Sinclair name carried an available balance of 0. Mason was bankrupt. He could not afford a public defender, let alone a high-powered shark in a tailored suit. His leverage was non-existent. The heavy steel door clicked unlocked, the deadbolt firing like a gunshot. I walked into the room, flanked by my lead corporate attorney. I wore a structured charcoal blazer, a crisp white silk blouse, and sharp stilettos. My heels clicked rhythmically against the linoleum floor, broadcasting a measured, predatory cadence. The federal agents nodded respectfully, allowing me to take the empty chair at the end of the table. Federal justice guidelines permit the primary victim of severe identity theft and wire fraud to observe specific evidentiary disclosures prior to the grand jury convening. I secured my presence by proving I was the target of the forged mortgage application. Mason stared at me. His jaw trembled. His eyes darted between my attorney and the federal agents. He expected me to negotiate a bailout. He clung to the pathetic hope that familial ties would override a federal indictment, assuming I arrived to post his bail and secure his release. I did not speak. I opened my leather briefcase and retrieved a sleek, black tablet. The lead investigator took the device from my hand, placing it precisely in the center of the scratched metal surface. He tapped the screen. A high-definition video began to play, the audio routing through the small speakers. Mason leaned forward, squinting under the harsh lighting. The footage displayed the adjacent interrogation room, recorded just hours prior. Chloe sat in the exact same model of metal chair. The transformation was striking. She wore a plain gray sweatshirt, devoid of her usual designer makeup. Her hair was pulled back into a severe, messy knot. The confident, boastful influencer who broadcasted her imported caviar on social media was entirely eradicated. My brother watched his wife speak to the camera with terrifying, unvarnished clarity. Chloe did not hesitate. She traded her marital vows for a state cooperation agreement. On the recording, she meticulously detailed the chronological timeline of the fraud. She explained how Mason engineered the initial breach into the family legacy trust, providing the specific dates he utilized the forged notarizations to extract the $250,000. She supplied the offshore routing numbers used to wash the capital through her event planning boutique, confirming her role was directed entirely by her husband. Chloe then described the exact moment Mason panicked inside the Greenwich estate study. She outlined how he accessed what he believed to be a secondary lending portal. She testified that Mason explicitly told her he forged my digital signature to secure a phantom equity loan to pay the screaming vendors. She handed the investigators the text messages he sent her boasting about the successful theft. Chloe did not stop at her husband. She systematically dismantled the entire Sinclair hierarchy, offering the prosecutors a pristine roadmap to indict the patriarch and matriarch. She stated on the federal record that my parents, Charles and Victoria, possessed full, prior knowledge of the money laundering operation. Chloe testified that my mother explicitly approved the use of stolen funds to finance the anniversary gala, prioritizing her country club reputation over legal compliance. She recounted conversations where Charles advised Mason on how to obscure the digital paper trail. The video concluded. The screen faded to black. The silence in the interrogation room felt suffocating. Mason stared at the blank tablet, his mouth hanging open in paralyzed horror. The woman he married, The partner he expected to shoulder the blame and protect his fragile ego had surgically severed his head to save her own skin. The illusion of their glamorous power couple dynamic shattered into a million irrecoverable pieces right in front of his eyes. The reality of a 20-year federal sentence materialized in the cold air. A cornered animal will gnaw off its own limb to escape a steel snare. Mason chose a different sacrifice. He erupted from his chair. The metal legs scraped harshly against the linoleum. He pointed a trembling, frantic finger at the dark screen. "She is lying," he shrieked, his voice cracking into a high, hysterical register. He ignored the federal agents entirely, directing his frantic defense at me. "She is trying to frame me to save her business." My parents orchestrated the entire cover-up. They knew the trust was depleted. Charles commanded me to forge the documents to save the Greenwich house from foreclosure. Victoria picked out the caterers, knowing the accounts were frozen. They instructed me to do it. "You have to believe me. Elena, they are the ones who stole your signature." They made me do it. I sat perfectly still, observing the spectacular implosion. The golden child was weeping, actively volunteering his own parents to the federal penitentiary in a desperate bid to reduce his sentencing guidelines. He was offering the investigators the very people who had worshipped him his entire life. The flawless family, built on exclusionary arrogance and superficial aesthetics, was tearing each other apart like starving rats in a sinking barrel. There was no loyalty. There was no honor. There was only raw, unfiltered panic. I stood up, smoothing the front of my blazer with slow, deliberate precision. I looked down at the shivering, broken man who just a week ago had declared I ruined his social networking. I offered him a chilling, razor-sharp smile. The satisfaction washing over me was pristine and clinical. A perfectly balanced ledger. "Enjoy the aesthetic in here, Mason," I whispered, ensuring the words resonated in the quiet room. "It is strictly for family." I turned on my heel and walked out the heavy steel door, my attorney close behind. The lock clicked shut, sealing my brother in his concrete cage. The criminal liabilities were secured, but the financial warfare remained incomplete. While Mason traded his parents for a plea deal, Charles and Victoria still occupied the Greenwich estate, clutching the fading embers of their aristocratic delusion. It was time to execute the final asset seizure. It was time to take the house. The criminal liabilities were secured behind the heavy, steel doors of the federal courthouse. My brother was locked inside a windowless holding cell, stripped of his bespoke tailoring and his arrogant delusions. The criminal justice system would handle his incarceration. But the financial execution remained my exclusive domain. Stepping out into the sharp New York afternoon, I inhaled the crisp air and signaled my legal team to initiate the final phase. The legal machinery accelerated with a terrifying, unstoppable velocity. Because my holding company had legally acquired the defaulted debt portfolios belonging to both Mason and Charles during my strategic trip to Geneva, I now held the supreme, unchallenged authority of a primary creditor. In the hierarchy of corporate restructuring, the primary creditor dictates the terms of survival. I did not just want to recover their stolen capital. I intended to eradicate the very foundation of their unearned pride. I instructed my lead attorney to file a formal writ of execution in the civil division of the federal court. We bypassed the standard collection queues and bureaucratic delays. My attorney presented the federal magistrate with a pristine, unredacted forensic accounting dossier. The file contained the forged digital signatures, the offshore routing numbers, and the explicit text message logs detailing their coordinated effort to defraud investors. The evidence was bulletproof. The judge reviewed the documentation, recognized the severe flight risk and the ongoing dissipation of assets, and signed the emergency injunction without a second thought. The court order granted my firm immediate, comprehensive asset seizure rights across all properties and accounts bearing the Sinclair name. The operation required surgical precision. I retained a private logistics firm that specialized in high-net-worth liquidations, coordinating their deployment alongside the United States Marshal Service. At precisely 8 in the morning on a crisp Thursday, a synchronized fleet of unmarked moving trucks and law enforcement vehicles descended upon two separate targets simultaneously. The first strike hit the Manhattan penthouse my brother had leased to project the illusion of limitless venture capital. The building concierge stepped aside the moment the federal agents presented the court order. The tactical team breached the customized oak doors, securing the perimeter before the liquidation contractors flooded the space. They moved with mechanical efficiency. The contractors carried heavy-duty dollies and digital inventory scanners. They dismantled the Italian leather sectionals, unplugged the imported espresso machines, and wrapped the velvet dining chairs in protective industrial plastic. The hollow kingdom Mason had built on stolen trust funds was boxed up and hauled into the freight elevator in less than 2 hours. The second strike struck the true heart of the Sinclair delusion. A convoy of heavy transport trucks idled at the wrought iron gates of the sprawling Greenwich estate. My parents were sitting in their sunlit breakfast nook, attempting to map out a defense strategy, when heavy fists pounded against their mahogany front door. Charles pulled the door open, his face flushed with indignation, ready to berate whoever dared to interrupt his morning. He froze when he saw the tactical vests and the gold badges shining in the morning light. The lead marshal handed Charles the signed writ of execution. The document authorized the immediate removal of all non-essential physical property to satisfy the outstanding corporate debt. Before my father could formulate a coherent objection, a dozen contractors marched past him into the grand foyer. The dismantling of their precious aesthetic was methodical and relentless. Liquidators carrying clipboards walked through the opulent living spaces, slapping neon barcode stickers onto 18th century oil paintings and antique sideboards. Moving crews unhooked the custom silk curtains from their brass rods. The imported crystal chandeliers, the very fixtures that had illuminated their fraudulent anniversary gala just weeks prior, were carefully uninstalled, wrapped in thick foam, and packed into padded wooden crates. Victoria rushed down the sweeping staircase, her silk morning robe trailing behind her. She watched in paralyzed horror as two workers rolled her prized grand piano out the front door on a heavy-duty dolly. She shrieked, demanding they stop, reaching out to grab the arm of a passing contractor. A federal agent stepped smoothly between them, resting his hand on his utility belt, advising her to step back and allow the court-ordered procedure to continue. Charles stood near the fireplace, his chest heaving, holding his smartphone to his ear. He was dialing a list of high-powered defense attorneys, but every call went straight to a generic voicemail. He had no retainers left. Outside in the circular driveway, the final physical symbols of their aristocratic facade were systematically removed. The repossession teams targeted the remaining luxury vehicles. A heavy flatbed tow truck reversed toward the vintage European sports car Charles polished every weekend. The steel winch cable hooked onto the undercarriage. The hydraulic motor whirred, dragging the pristine vehicle up the metal ramp. The scraping sound of the tires gripping the steel echoed across the manicured lawn. While the physical assets vanished from their properties, a far more devastating sweep occurred in the digital realm. I sat behind the walnut desk in my Manhattan corner office, monitoring the execution through my proprietary software dashboard. The court-ordered garnishments bypassed standard banking delays. I watched the financial data stream across my dual monitors. Every single checking account, every high-yield savings fund, and every hidden investment portfolio tied to their social security numbers was drained. The green numerals on my screen ticked downward in rapid succession, plummeting until they hit a hard, inescapable zero. The routing numbers faded from active to closed. Their monetary existence was officially terminated. The silence of my office was broken by the blinking red indicator on my desk console. The private line registered incoming communications. I did not answer the phone. I let the automated system collect the audio. Over the course of the afternoon, Victoria left 14 frantic voicemails. I sat back in my ergonomic chair and played the messages in chronological order. The audio evolution painted a vivid picture of a crumbling matriarch. The first few recordings were filled with arrogant demands, commanding me to call off the federal agents and respect the family hierarchy. By the seventh message, the tone shifted into desperate bargaining. She promised to apologize for the anniversary party, offering empty platitudes about repairing our relationship. The final voicemail lacked any trace of her former elite status. Her voice was broken, raw, and choked with hyperventilation. The background noise revealed the hollow echo of an entirely empty house. "Elena, you cannot do this to us." Victoria wailed into the receiver, her breath hitching painfully. "The trucks took everything. There is nowhere to sit. The bank just called and said the accounts are frozen. We raised you. We provided for you. You are leaving your own parents homeless. Please, pick up the phone. You have to stop this." I listened to the recording finish, feeling a profound, untouchable peace settling over my shoulders. The woman who had prioritized imported floral arrangements over her own daughter was now standing in a barren room, weeping over the loss of her superficial inventory. She expected sentimentality to override a legally binding debt collection. I did not call her back. Providing the auditory comfort of a two-way conversation would only feed her delusion that a negotiation was still possible. I picked up my encrypted mobile device. I opened a new text message thread directed to her primary number. I typed a single, perfectly crafted response. "Asset liquidation is standard procedure for fraudulent accounts. Sentiment is for people who cannot afford strategy." I utilized the exact toxic ideology my father had weaponized against me a decade ago. He taught me that business requires the elimination of emotion. I simply applied his curriculum to his own life. I pressed send, watching the delivery confirmation light up the screen. Night fell over the Greenwich estate. The sprawling mansion, once a beacon of high society gatherings, was stripped entirely bare. No plush velvet sofas, no oil paintings, no Persian rugs to soften their footsteps. The rooms echoed with the hollow, unforgiving sound of total ruin. Charles and Victoria stood in the center of their cavernous master bedroom. The ornate mahogany wardrobes were gone. They were forced to gather their remaining custom-tailored clothing and designer shoes, stuffing the expensive fabrics into cheap, black plastic trash bags provided by the liquidation crew. They were entirely displaced from the billionaire lifestyle they had faked for decades. They had no cars, no cash, and no furniture. They were merely waiting for the final summons, a concluding confrontation that would eradicate the last remaining pillar of their shattered empire. 6 weeks passed. The dust generated by the initial federal raids settled into an unbearable, suffocating reality for the Sinclair family. The Greenwich estate devolved into a hollow mausoleum, without liquid capital to pay the utility companies. The central heating system shut down. My parents survived the early autumn chill by wearing layered coats indoors, sleeping on cheap inflatable mattresses surrounded by the black plastic trash bags holding their remaining wardrobe. The isolation was profound and unyielding. Their country club peers ignored their phone calls. Their elite neighbors looked the other way when they walked down the driveway. The legal bills mounted as various unpaid contractors filed civil suits against their names. They were drowning in a sea of litigation with zero financial buoyancy. A courier delivered a heavy cardstock envelope to their front door on a Tuesday morning. It contained a formal legal mandate instructing them to appear at my Manhattan corporate headquarters. Desperation breeds a very specific type of psychological delusion. Instead of reading the document as a hostile summons, Charles and Victoria interpreted the letter as a white flag. They convinced themselves that the mandated cooling-off period had ended. They believed their daughter, having proven her point through the asset seizures, was finally ready to negotiate a discreet settlement. They assumed I would offer a monthly allowance and restore the natural family hierarchy. They traveled into the city on a public commuter train. For 3 decades, my father only traversed that route in the back of a privately chartered town car, insulated behind tinted glass. Now, He sat shoulder to shoulder with the working-class commuters he always despised. He clutched a worn leather briefcase that contained no leveraged portfolios or lucrative contracts. They walked the 6 blocks from the transit station to my high-rise, battling the harsh city wind. By the time they reached the ground-floor lobby, they looked less like aristocrats and more like exhausted refugees seeking asylum from a storm they created. The front desk security detail directed them to the 50th floor. The guards offered no special greetings and no deferential nods. My parents were processed as standard hostile visitors. My executive assistant escorted them into the primary glass-enclosed boardroom and instructed them to wait. The room was architecturally designed for intimidation. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying, unobstructed view of the New York skyline, making the occupants feel suspended in midair. An imposing slab of polished mahogany stretched across the center of the space, surrounded by severe black leather chairs. Charles and Victoria took their seats at the far end of the long table. The preceding 6 weeks had aged them a decade. My mother, a woman who previously spent thousands of dollars a month on cosmetic upkeep, now revealed stark gray roots tracing along her hairline. Her posture, once rigid with unearned superiority, sagged heavily under the weight of sustained anxiety. Charles wore a charcoal suit salvaged from his former life, but the fine wool fabric hung loosely over his frame. The stress of the federal investigation had carved deep, hollow shadows under his cheekbones. They sat in tense silence, folding their hands on the wood grain, clinging to their last shred of fabricated hope. The heavy oak double doors clicked unlocked. I did not enter the room alone. The illusion of a private family reconciliation shattered the moment I crossed the threshold. I walked in flanked by 2 distinct figures. On my right stood my lead corporate attorney, carrying a thick binder of forensic audits and asset schedules. On my left walked a stern, gray-haired man wearing a dark navy suit. A silver lapel pin identified him as a senior prosecutor for the United States Department of Justice. The sight of the federal prosecutor triggered a frantic survival reflex in my mother. She realized the meeting was not a rescue mission. She pushed her chair back, the metal legs scraping harshly against the polished floor. She lunged forward, her eyes blazing with a potent mixture of terror and desperate fury. She opened her mouth, inhaling sharply, preparing to launch into a theatrical, manipulative tirade about family loyalty, forgiveness, and the sacrifices of motherhood. She did not get the chance to speak a single word. The federal prosecutor stepped forward and raised his hand. The gesture was simple, firm, and radiated undisputed government authority. He instructed her to sit down and remain silent. He informed her that any unsolicited statements made in this room could and would be added to the pending grand jury indictment regarding her role in the wire fraud conspiracy. Victoria snapped her mouth shut. Her knees buckled slightly. She sank back into her leather chair, her chest heaving as silent tears began to spill over her eyelashes. I walked past my escorts and took my seat at the head of the mahogany table. I placed my secure tablet on the polished wood. I wore a tailored midnight blue suit, my hair pulled back into a severe, sleek knot. The visual contrast between my pristine corporate armor and their disheveled ruin was stark and undeniable. I radiated a cool, unyielding dominance. I let the silence stretch for 10 agonizing seconds, forcing them to absorb the sheer magnitude of their defeat before I offered an explanation. "You are not here to negotiate a settlement," I stated. My voice sliced through the chilled air of the boardroom like a surgical scalpel. I enunciated every syllable to ensure the reality of their situation penetrated their lingering delusion. There will be no monthly allowance. There will be no quiet restoration of your social status. You are here to sign the final deed transfers to satisfy your outstanding debts. I tapped the screen of my tablet. My attorney slid a stack of legal documents down the length of the table. The heavy bond paper came to rest directly in front of my father. "You collectively owe my firm $2.4 million, I continued, maintaining unwavering eye contact with the broken patriarch. That figure includes the stolen trust capital, the accrued interest, the extensive legal fees required to seize your physical assets, and the court-ordered punitive damages for intentional fraud. Charles stared down at the documents. The bold ink outlined his total financial annihilation. The former titan of the Sinclair family began to tremble. His hands shook so severely he had to press his palms flat against the tabletop to steady himself. His patriarchal arrogance, the very shield he used to mock my ambitions for 10 years, was entirely eradicated. He looked up at me, his eyes red and pooling with unshed tears. "We have nothing whatsoever left to give you. Elena," he choked out. His voice was a pathetic, reedy whisper, devoid of its usual booming resonance. The federal trucks cleared out the estate. The banks drained the holding accounts. My son is sitting in a federal penitentiary awaiting trial. We do not have a single dollar to our names. You took it all. I watched the tears spill down his hollow cheeks and splash onto the pristine mahogany. I did not feel a trace of sympathy. I felt the crisp, satisfying finality of a perfectly balanced ledger. He genuinely believed the execution was over. He assumed losing his liquid wealth and his furniture was the ceiling of his punishment. He lacked the analytical imagination to comprehend the true depth of the corporate machinery I had deployed against his legacy. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table surface, preparing to deliver the ultimate, mind-bending payoff. I did not take a single thing from you. Charles, I corrected. My tone dropped to a lethal whisper, carrying clearly across the quiet expanse of the room. I reached into the leather portfolio, resting at my side. My fingers brushed the thick, embossed edge of a legal document. I withdrew the heavy parchment and placed it flat against the polished mahogany surface. With a gentle push of my index finger, I slid the paperwork down the length of the table. The document glided over the wood grain, coming to a halt precisely inches from his trembling hands. I bought it. Charles and Victoria stared blindly at the paper. They lacked the cognitive capacity to process the dense, legal text filling the page, but the official seal stamped at the bottom required no translation. It was the unencumbered property deed to their cherished Greenwich mansion. This was the exact location of the opulent anniversary gala I was banned from attending. The unencumbered deed represented more than just real estate. It represented the fortress they used to project their false superiority. For decades, my mother treated that property as her personal sovereign territory, a physical manifestation of her unearned pride. The document bore the official watermark of the county clerk, indicating a finalized, irreversible transfer of ownership, the legal description of the land, the boundaries of the estate, and the structural additions were outlined in dense typography. My name, listed as the primary managing director of my holding company, sat boldly on the designated line. I leaned back into my ergonomic chair, crossing my arms over my chest, observing their confusion. When you defaulted on your fraudulent mortgages to finance that ridiculous anniversary party, I explained, your lender panicked. You utilized fabricated equity to secure those commercial loans, and the moment the federal investigation froze your assets, your bank classified your mortgage as toxic debt. Financial institutions abhor prolonged foreclosure battles on contaminated properties involving criminal suspects. They initiated a silent, expedited auction to offload the liability from their books. My holding company stepped in and acquired the debt outright for pennies on the dollar. I bypassed the standard eviction delays by executing the primary creditor clause. The bank wiped their hands of you, and I legally took possession of the house you threw me out of. My father stared at the deed, the realization sinking into his hollow features. He understood he was sitting across from his landlord. Victoria, however, possessed a relentless, delusional optimism born from decades of privilege. She heard the word ownership and immediately constructed a fabricated lifeline. She assumed my purchase was a twisted rescue mission. She believed I bought the estate to keep it within the family portfolio. perhaps intending to banish them to the guest wing while retaining the primary residence as an investment property. A shaky, desperate breath escaped her lips. Her posture straightened slightly, the tension leaving her shoulders. "You are not going to tear it down," Victoria whispered, her eyes searching my face for a trace of familial mercy. "You saved the estate. I am not bulldozing the property," I confirmed, allowing a cold, flawless smile to grace my lips. Demolishing a structure with such pristine architectural bones would be a terrible waste of square footage. However, you are severely misunderstanding my intent. I have zero interest in preserving your legacy. I am converting your elitist, exclusionary country estate into a fully funded technical training headquarters for disadvantaged women of color. The poetic justice was sharp and undeniable. My mother had spent her entire adult life looking down upon minorities and working-class individuals at her racist country club. She curated her social circle with meticulous prejudice, ensuring her environment remained uniformly wealthy and superficial. Now, the very demographic she despised was about to take permanent ownership of her sanctuary. The fortress she built to exclude the world was becoming a launch pad for the underprivileged. "The transformation begins tomorrow morning," I announced, listing the logistical reality of her nightmare. "A fleet of commercial contractors is scheduled to arrive at dawn. We are stripping the imported marble out of the grand foyer to install a heavy-duty reception desk. The formal dining room, where you hosted local politicians and hedge fund managers, is being retrofitted with high-capacity cooling units to house our server racks. The sprawling manicured lawns will host intensive coding boot camps and financial literacy seminars. We are not just offering weekend workshops," I added, pouring salt into the open wound of her pride. 50 scholarship students are moving into the residential wings by the end of the month. We are outfitting the master suite, the very room where you hoarded your designer wardrobes, with heavy-duty bunk beds and collaborative study stations. These brilliant young women will walk through the same mahogany doors you guarded so fiercely. They will study algorithmic trading in your sunroom and practice cybersecurity defense protocols in your vaulted library. They will use your former kingdom to build empires of their own. The aesthetic you prized above all else is receiving a permanent, structural upgrade. You wanted an exclusive space. I am making it the most exclusive technology incubator on the eastern seaboard. And your kind is permanently banned from the premises. The psychological impact of my words hit Victoria with the force of a physical blow. The delusion shattered, leaving nothing but the unbearable truth. She let out a guttural, blood-curdling shriek that pierced the quiet atmosphere of the boardroom. The sound was ragged and primal, echoing off the glass partitions. Her legs gave out beneath her. She collapsed sideways, slipping out of her black leather chair and crashing onto the polished floor. She lay there, weeping hysterically, her hands clawing at the carpet as the reality of her total social annihilation crushed her spirit. Charles did not rush to help his wife. He remained seated at the table, his eyes glued to the property deed. The patriarch of the Sinclair family buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking as he wept openly. The tears slipped through his fingers, falling onto the cuffs of his salvaged suit. They had not just lost their home. I had permanently replaced their monument of arrogance with a monument of empowerment. The legacy they spent 30 years building was erased, repurposed to serve the exact people they considered beneath them. They were forced to witness the total inversion of their toxic ideology. The senior federal prosecutor, who had remained a silent observer throughout the exchange, decided the time for mourning had expired. He stepped forward, standing directly behind my father. He opened his own leather binder, producing a stack of pristine federal documents bearing the official seal of the Department of Justice. He placed a silver pen next to the property transfer forms I had slid across the table earlier. He did not yell, but his voice carried the heavy, undeniable weight of the United States government. "You have a binary choice today, Charles," the prosecutor stated, his tone devoid of any negotiation. You will sign the clean title transfer right now, relinquishing any remaining legal claims, contestations, or squatting rights associated with the Greenwich property. If you execute the transfer, the government will proceed solely with the financial fraud indictments related to your son. If you refuse to sign, I have a team of agents standing by in the lobby. I will execute the secondary arrest warrants for gross tax evasion and obstruction of justice against both you and your wife before you leave this building. The threat was immediate and lethal. Charles looked at the federal prosecutor, then down at his weeping wife on the floor, and finally at me. He searched my expression for a fraction of hesitation, a tiny crack in my armor. He found nothing but the cold, calculating gaze of the liquidator he created. I sat perfectly still, offering no comfort and no reprieve. I commanded the room through absolute silence. Sign the transfer. Charles, I ordered, my voice cutting through the sound of my mother sobbing on the floor. My father reached for the silver pen. His fingers trembled so violently, he fumbled the polished metal twice before securing his grip. He pressed the tip of the pen against the signature line of the property deed. The ink flowed onto the heavy paper, capturing the frantic, jagged strokes of a defeated man signing away his kingdom. He finalized the document, the scratching sound echoing loudly in the tense boardroom. He pushed the paper back across the table, his head hanging in total surrender. The transaction was complete. 6 months passed with the swift, unforgiving momentum of a turning tide. The Greenwich estate, once a heavily guarded fortress of exclusionary wealth, underwent a metamorphosis that erased every trace of the Sinclair aesthetic. I walked through the grand foyer on a Tuesday morning, listening to the new rhythm of the property. The imported marble floors, where my mother once paraded her elite guests, were now covered by thick, anti-static industrial matting. The vaulted ballroom, the exact location where my brother attempted to peddle stolen intellectual property to a tech billionaire, buzzed with a different kind of energy. Rows of sleek, black data servers hummed a steady, rhythmic mechanical pulse, replacing the trill of string quartets. The crystal chandeliers had been uninstalled, traded for high-efficiency environmental lighting arrays that illuminated dozens of collaborative workstations. Young women of color, brilliant minds selected from rigorous academic pools, occupied the space. I watched a 20-year-old scholarship student sitting near the arched bay windows. She was running a complex forensic accounting algorithm, dissecting a simulated corporate fraud case right where the caviar stations used to sit. The air smelled of ozone, warm circuitry, and fresh coffee, a stark departure from the suffocating perfume and vintage champagne that previously haunted the halls. The monument to inherited arrogance was dead, reborn as a crucible for genuine merit. Watching those students claim the very rooms where my family schemed and plotted offered a profound, quiet satisfaction. The real estate was no longer a weapon of social division. It was a functioning engine of opportunity. Hundreds of miles away, the golden child of the Sinclair bloodline navigated a much bleaker transformation. The federal justice system finalized its verdict without an ounce of leniency. The judge handed down a 12-year sentence in a medium-security penitentiary. I received a copy of his intake profile through my legal network. Mason no longer wore bespoke Italian tailoring or rare chronographs. The penal bureaucracy issued him a faded, scratchy uniform and assigned him a designated identification number. His daily routine shifted from orchestrating phantom venture capital deals in Manhattan high-rises to a mandated labor detail in the prison laundry sector. He spends 8 hours a day standing on wet concrete, loading heavy, damp institutional linens into industrial washing machines. The harsh smell of cheap bleach permeates his skin, a permanent replacement for his custom cologne. The man who scoffed at my corporate career, labeling it a boring joke, now adheres to a rigid, unyielding schedule dictated by correction officers. He eats processed meals on a stainless steel tray, surrounded by individuals who care nothing for his former social pedigree. His universe shrank to the dimensions of a concrete cell and a fenced exercise yard. The delusion of his invincibility shattered against the iron bars of reality. He had over a decade to calculate the exact cost of his profound greed. Isolated from the wealth he thought made him untouchable. The collateral damage of his fraud extended far beyond the prison walls. Chloe, the woman who traded her marriage vows for a state cooperation agreement, evaded federal incarceration but paid an exorbitant price for her freedom. Stripped of the money-laundering event planning boutique and the stolen trust capital, she vanished from the Northeastern Social Registry. The terms of her deal required a quiet, untraceable existence. She relocated to a sprawling, anonymous suburb outside Atlanta, Georgia. The curated luxury influencer persona evaporated into the digital ether. Her social media accounts were permanently deleted, erasing the fabricated aristocratic lifestyle she worshipped. I pulled a brief background check on her new identity to ensure the non-disclosure agreements remained intact. Chloe now works an entry-level administrative desk job at a regional insurance brokerage. Her days consist of answering multi-line telephones and routing customer service inquiries from a beige, windowless cubicle. She commutes in a used sedan, navigating heavy traffic instead of being chauffeured to country club brunches. The ring lights, the designer handbags, and the fawning followers are gone. She surrendered her entire identity to avoid wearing an orange jumpsuit. The silence of her new, unremarkable life serves as a constant reminder of the hollow empire she tried to build on stolen funds. My parents faced a punishment tailored precisely to their unique psychological vulnerabilities. The federal seizure of the Greenwich estate and the liquidation of their hidden accounts left them destitute. They were officially excommunicated from the elite circles they spent 3 decades cultivating. When the money vanished, the invitations stopped arriving. The country club peers blocked their phone numbers, treating the Sinclair name like a contagious financial virus. Lacking the resources to maintain a presence in Connecticut, Charles and Victoria were forced into a cramped, one-bedroom apartment situated in a low-income, industrial suburb. The transition stripped away their dignity, layer by layer. The thin walls of their new residence offer zero insulation from the sounds of the neighboring units and the relentless roar of the nearby interstate highway. Victoria, a woman who previously summoned private chefs, now navigates a narrow galley kitchen with peeling linoleum floors. Charles, the former patriarch who roared orders from mahogany studies, sits for hours in front of a small television, staring blankly at the screen. They possess no assets to manage, no social standing to leverage, and no legacy to protect. They wake up every morning in a cheap, drafty apartment, haunted by the knowledge that their own exclusionary tactics sealed their fate. They discarded their daughter to preserve a superficial image, only to find themselves permanently banished to the very socioeconomic tier they spent their entire lives mocking. I stood on the expansive terrace of my Manhattan penthouse, wrapping my tailored coat tighter against the biting winter chill. The cold wind whipped across the balcony, carrying the ambient roar of the city below. The glittering New York skyline stretched out before me, an endless grid of illuminated towers piercing the night sky. The chaotic, suffocating noise of my former family had been permanently silenced. The threat they posed to my peace and my professional integrity was neutralized through precise, undeniable leverage. I did not just survive their cruel exclusion. I weaponized their blinding arrogance to build an impenetrable corporate empire. They attempted to use my intellect to save their sinking ship, and I utilized their greed to purchase the ocean they were drowning in. The glass doors behind me reflected the pristine, quiet sanctuary I built with my own hands. There were no manipulative demands echoing through the halls, no expectations to shrink myself to fit their fragile egos. The moral of this prolonged warfare resonates in every fiber of my being. You must never set yourself on fire to keep toxic individuals warm. When the people you are supposed to trust show you that you do not belong at their table, you do not shed a tear. You certainly do not beg for a seat. You pivot. You consolidate your resources. You buy the entire building. You evict them from the premises. And you construct your own kingdom directly on the ashes of their deceit. Society dictates that shared genetics require unconditional forgiveness. A dangerous myth designed to trap the successful into subsidizing the parasitic. The reality of high-stakes survival teaches a different curriculum. Blood merely makes you relatives. A biological coincidence, offering no guarantee of character. Fierce loyalty, mutual respect, and ruthless boundaries are what actually forge a family. I looked out over the empire I secured, raising a silent toast to the quiet, devastating power of holding the line. The ledger was closed. The debt was settled. The execution was flawless. I keep a framed digital printout on the wall of my private study. It is not a university diploma, nor is it a family photograph. It is the original clearing receipt for the $10,000 wire transfer my mother demanded as the price of my exclusion. That single sheet of paper represents the exact moment I stopped being a daughter and became an architect of consequences. Looking back at the synchronized dismantling of the Sinclair estate, the operation yielded 3 distinct operational truths, principles that now govern my reality. First, silence is the most lethal asset in any negotiation. When individuals attempt to diminish your worth or exclude you from their circles, the natural human instinct is to demand a seat at the table. Do not argue with people committed to their own fabricated superiority. They expect outrage. They anticipate a defense. By offering them total, unyielding quiet, you allow their arrogance to expand unchecked until it blurs their peripheral vision. Let them believe they hold the upper hand. A target who feels secure will always hand you the leverage required to finalize their downfall. Second, shared genetics do not grant unlimited lines of credit. Society conditions us to view family as an inherent sanctuary, demanding unconditional loyalty regardless of the psychological cost. That is a dangerous, predatory myth designed to turn successful individuals into permanent safety nets for the incompetent. Emotional extortion is a toxic liability you must systematically purge from your portfolio. Treat your peace of mind, your intellectual property, and your financial boundaries with the same clinical rigor you apply to a corporate audit. If a relationship operates at a perpetual deficit, terminate the funding. Third, true power never requires an audience until the trap snaps shut. My parents and my brother wasted their lives curating a loud, expensive aesthetic to mask a hollow foundation. They broadcasted their wealth to Project Dominance. Real leverage operates in the shadows. It is built through late-night coding sessions, discreet offshore banking maneuvers, and the unannounced acquisition of secondary debt. You do not need to advertise your retaliation or scream your intentions. Let the sudden arrival of federal marshals or the finality of a signed property deed speak on your behalf. The loudest voice in the room is always overcompensating for a fatal structural flaw. The ashes of their deceit provided the perfect foundation for my empire. If you are currently sitting at a table where your value is treated as a footnote, take this as your official notice to stand up, secure your assets, and rewrite the contract. Do not shrink to fit a narrative designed to keep you small. Thank you for joining me here on Silent Vengeance Stories. If you know someone who needs a reminder to weaponize their boundaries and reclaim their leverage, share this case file. Drop a comment below to let me know which of these 3 lessons resonated with your own survival strategy. And ensure you hit subscribe for more blueprints on dismantling toxic empires. The ledger is officially closed.